Hi, I'm Simone. I go by she, her.
Sika, she, they.
I'm Aiden, he, him.
I'm Nomi, she, her, and we're Stan.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about His House, which is a 2020 film. A little spiel on it from what IMDb says: a refugee couple takes a harrowing escape from a war-torn South Sudan, but they struggle to adjust to their new life in an English town that has evil lurking beneath the surface. So it's basically a horror film about South Sudan refugees. And we're going to talk about a couple different scenes that we found really interesting, especially focusing on perspective. So the first one was a scene that I noticed the nightmare perspective in the beginning of the film when Bull is having a nightmare. But at first, it seems like the audience, it looks like it's just a movie talking about the background of the characters, because you see Bull and Yingak in the very beginning, Bull carrying Yingak in like a dry plane, which is presumably South Sudan, as you don't really know anything because it's like literally the first thing you see in the film. And you just get to see that it's all from Bull's perspective, especially when you're talking about the part of the scene where you see Yungak drowning. You see it's Bull's PTSD being shown in the very beginning of the film, which is going to be a huge part of the theme. So that's really important, and especially when he wakes up, you see it's shot from like a low. I mean, yeah, it's shot from a low angle. You can see like his face from below, like he's laying down, and in the foreground you can see Rial's face in the foreground, even though it's still his perspective. It's just to show a kind of his psychological state.
I think that's very interesting that kind of in between perspectives of like we're observing him, but we're still seeing what he's feeling. I think that's seen often. And I also think between the two, Rial and Bull, we are presented with one of the main constants is that they're together, that they've experienced everything in the past together, and they're still experiencing what's new, what's to come, especially in this new world of England. I feel like that is especially then shown when we move to a new sequence of them entering the house. It is first emphasized very much how much this house is theirs. They're tied to this. You must reside at this address. You must not move from this address. This is your home now. This is what all their suffering in the past has led to. This is where they are. So what is very interesting is like I think in horror, what is very helpful is that we are experiencing things at the same time as these main characters. So we're seeing things and seeing new aspects and events with them. Many of the first shots of them entering the house are from a distance, as if somebody's watching. We don't get a lot of information. Usually it's just like one new subject of the door broke, the light flickers and dies. There's wide shots of Rial entering the room with the walls peeling. All these problems that we see. I really like the perspective of Bull in the kitchen. He tries the stove, it doesn't work. And there's one sequence of, it's first a low angle shot of his face from the floor. He looks down into the camera, it switches from his perspective, then a high angle down, looking at where that low angle was, looking at the pizza box. He then opens the pizza box. We see this at the same time. We saw the signs before of him holding his nose, but we see, oh, this is the source of the smell. And at that same time, Mark mentions that there's a smell. We see, it emphasizes the decrepit situation that they're in. It's kind of an interesting kind of match on action where like we gain new information when he turns or when he looks at something else. In the same way, after this, there's an over-the-shoulder shot of Rial looking at him. He looks up, he looks at her, and it switches from his perspective then to her perspective. She's looking at him, and then he looks back at her. And there's a lot communicated with just their eyes. And it kind of shows, even though the different people, they kind of share this similar perspective. They're on the same page. They're in this together.
Yeah, I also think what's really important in this sequence is that when they first enter the house, they are actually like physically separated in the house. They both wander their own ways. And I think that speaks to how they each relate to the house differently in the future, and how they both experience their own trauma with their past situation.
Yeah, I think that sort of many sequences use that variable of sort of two perspectives at once, or sort of switching a lot or often from two different characters' perspectives, especially in the sequence where Rial goes to the doctor, like that woman, and at first, this sequence is sort of very feels kind of detached from the rest of the movie. We are we begin in the doctor's perspective, and there's this is sort of also a seamless way for a lot of information about Rial's story to be given to us in a way that doesn't feel forced, since we were sort of like hearing these things for the first time, but we're also not like Rial just kind of like saying it, but we're someone else listening to her. Um, but this perspective, I feel, also separates us from Rial in a way. Even though, like, so far we think she's the protagonist, like we've experienced most of the film with her, we see her through the doctor's eyes in the sequence, and there's something sort of disconcerting about her, um, almost like off-putting and almost like intimidating. I think this also, because we're in the doctor's perspective and we feel those feelings towards Rial, that also hints in a very subtle way at, eventually at the end of the film, her planning to harm Bol. Um, but that's sort of unrelated. But anyway, I think we know we are in the doctor's perspective through camera and editing, mainly like that one very quick shot of Rial's scars over here, that sort of we sort of notice them, or they're emphasized as the doctor is seeing them for the first time. Also, the close-ups of the doctor's reaction is sort of like we're feeling what she's feeling. Um, and when the doctor is like a more subtle one is like when the doctor is putting the hospital bracelet on Rial's arm, it's sort of like we're doing what the doctor is doing, and that's sort of like we are totally in her point of view, not just her perspective. Um, but this sequence is also, so this is like the two different perspective sort of thing. It's not entirely in the doctor's perspective. The close-ups of Rial, sort of, there's something about her expression that seems like she's looking down at the doctor, not physically, but like in a way that's sort of almost disdainful, like, um and I think because we've spent most of the movie with her, we feel this like loyalty to her to feel what she's feeling, and therefore we're also in some of the shots in her perspective. So yeah, I think this is a really like good example of a sequence where the perspective are constantly alternating, which is bringing up many different reactions and feelings in the audience.
I really agree with that. And to add to your point of Rial being just acting odd, I really felt that in the scene that Aiden Aiden was discussing about them in the house, and one said they're walking in two separate paths. It's like they take two different paths, two different ways of joining, of becoming someone who lives in the UK. Because Rial, I feel like, takes the way in which she decides to maintain her culture and not try to act any different. And I really felt that, and I really felt that that off-putting feeling had to do something partially with the cultural disconnect that we all had to the doctor, as well as what you're saying, but also like like kind of like a subline of just that cultural separation. And as we see later in the film, Bowl does not do that.
Yeah, I was gonna say again about like entering the house where like when Bull separates and sees this like jarring image of the pizza box and like the bugs in there. I think that's like heavily contrasted to how Rial walks through the house. It's sort of like she has a really calm presence when she walks throughout the house. And I think that definitely relates to how she is like very I guess you could say in some ways accepting of the past while he's trying to assimilate. He's like disgusted. You can see like the disgust on his face while he's walking through the house. Meanwhile, she has like a much more calm presence to her.
I definitely agree with that. Their kind of auras and actions and presences are very like polarly opposite. As you said, she's a lot more subdued, where I feel like his perspective is shown through how much action he takes about trying to fix the house all by himself. Him going to the store by himself, him looking through these aisles. We will assimilate, let's eat with a fork. Maybe we can get a table next time. Whereas she's quiet and she says like, oh, I can taste the metal. And it's very juxtaposing, but I think it shows a lot of how their mindsets are different when intaking this new space.
Okay, so the next sequence that sort of stood out to me, this is yet another one where there are sort of like alternating perspectives a little bit, and also there's a lot of objectivity in this one. I think it begins this meeting where Bol goes to talk to Mark about wanting to move houses. I think the sequence begins objectively through the camera angles. We're looking at both of them sort of through somewhat the same frame, and they're both like in the center. It's sort of and it's slightly low angle, like very slightly, but it's since we're looking at both of them through the same angle, we're not sort of viewing one of them in a different way than the other, and we're looking at this image at this meeting objectively. Once Bol asks to move houses, even though we know like what Mark doesn't know about the entire situation, and we understand Bol, since we're looking at the situation totally objectively in terms of perspective, we can't help but sort of begin to sort of lean towards Mark's side, or like how he's viewing things, because objectively he's the one that seems right. Like we're not the whole idea of this is that we're not looking at it through Bol's perspective, and even though we understand what's going on and like it makes sense to us, we're still not sort of totally in his shoes. And then this makes the perspective obviously naturally begin to lean towards Mark's. Bol sort of starts laughing, and he seems like genuinely a little unstable in this sequence because we're looking at it objectively, and therefore it becomes Mark's perspective. But I think his constant sort of like trying to impress Mark and like constantly like trying to smile even though he's very obviously under like very stressed out, it comes off as just like odd, and so which is what Mark is seeing. Like that's how Mark is experiencing this interaction. And up until Bol like breaks the glass and we notice it first, we're still in Mark's perspective. We're sort of like concerned and like a little weirded out. And then that's when the perspective changes, when we sort of like look down all of a sudden and we see the broken glass in our hands, in Bol's hands. And then we're very obviously in Bol's perspective. And I think this would be a totally different sequence if we were constantly in Bol's perspective. I think there's something about being objective that makes Mark sort of more humanized. It makes Bol seem like this scene being objectively filmed due to the camera angles sort of makes Bol seem a little crazy. And if that's the objective perspective, then it's sort of like, what does that say about the situation, on its own?
That's such a good point. I think it would be so interesting if we didn't have this scene, if Mark's perspective wasn't included, because you could say Mark isn't a major character, but this this perspective really shows how much of this issue is within. It's just between Bol and Ria and their house, and it's this elusive kind of within their head, and maybe the threat isn't as real, but more personal, based on their past experiences and trauma.
Does anybody have anything else to say about that? Before
Yes, I just wanted to say something about the beginning, especially where the first shot of that scene. I noticed that there's a kind of like vignette effect on the edges that's kind of dark. It looks darker and like it's like a wide lens, I think, because it looks like almost the teensiest bit fisheyed there. And I think it was a really good way to maintain a level of anxiety throughout that shot. Because if I feel like if it was just like a regular shot, it would just kind of look. It wouldn't have the same sort of it wouldn't create the same sort of uneasiness that vignette style does.
I think, yeah, like sort of the curved table gives Mark a certain position of authority. It makes him feel larger. But also at the same time, Mark doesn't have much, like it's not really up to him to really know these people. And I think that plays into the objectiveness because like he's not there to know them on a personal level. He's there to judge them on the superficial level of like, are they maintaining this house? Are they becoming like British citizens? And like the whole thing about them being good people, like he can't truly determine that. He just, it's just an objective. He just has to look at the situation objectively. And then I guess onto the next sequence about Nyagak getting stolen on the bus. I think this is indominantly Bol's perspective because there's all this chaos, right? There's a first shot of like, oh, I'm gonna start at the shot where he sees a child being brought on by the bus by a mother. And then afterwards, he assesses his afterwards, he looks at Nyagak, and then you see her saying "mama," right? And then afterwards, there's gunfire from the trucks, and then he looks back at Nyagak again. So these sort of inserted shots of the other surroundings in between the repetition of him looking at Nyagak shows that like shows the sort of like quick decision making that he had to make. And the first shot, we actually see the solution to his situation, which shows like how fast he had to consider this. Like, so first you see the child and then you see the gunfire, and then first you see the child, then you see Nyagak, then you see the gunfire, and then he has to make that decision. Okay, this is how I'm going to get onto the bus. And then the moment that he decides, there's a low angle looking up at him and it's completely isolated. And there's no other person in view except for his face. So it sort of shows the superiority that he has over Nyagak, but also the fact that it's like a completely like selfish decision and that he is only thinking of himself in that moment.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And one part that really, really resonated with me is like the speed and the speed in which those shots change. Because I'm not gonna say throughout the film, but like in other parts of this film, you don't see anything like that when it comes to him making decisions. You don't see a bunch of loud, like it's very clear that I don't think this is the type of person he was. Like, of course, he still definitely made that choice, but it definitely shows that he wasn't just, like an evil person just looking to use people. And it also really felt so much stronger because they chose to make that isolated shot, because he looks confused as well. When that shot's being shown, it doesn't look like he has a face of dominance. You can see like the confusion and fear and in his eyes, and it's profound. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like the isolated part, sort of like he can't, in that moment, he can't consider any of his other surroundings. And like, this is like, you can see sort of like the hesitance like in his face. But ultimately it's just him. And yeah. And I think showing the solution first and then the chaos and then Nyagak like in between, I think it really allows the audience to be in it and figure out with him like what he's gonna do, because you don't know what he's gonna do until you see it unfold.
Speaking about Bull's psychological state, there's one really, really, really interesting part of the film that got to me. So when Bull is shopping for like polos and stuff in the mall, there's a part near the end of his time in that location. There's a scene in which, there's two shots in which you see there's an advertisement in the back of a white British family, like, and with some like discounts and stuff. In the camera, the shot itself is like is not in Bull's perspective at all. I think it actually has to do with it kind of feels like a social commentary of how people treat refugees. I know the movie in a whole is kind of a social commentary of that, but this scene specifically, because you can literally see like that's English society looking down on Bull. So that's happening, the camera is zooming in to the what we can assume is the father of that family in the advertisement, and then the shot switches to the camera zooming into Rial in the house. And I just feel like it's a really loaded shot, because, well, actually that's the visual part. And then even before that, the sounds that you hear when he's shopping for these polos is like, there's like a prolonged groaning sound that repeats, and it gets really strong when they do that zoom. So that's why it really felt like it was like man versus society to me there.
I think like the music was really interesting in the when he's shopping, because it sort of feels like it should be set in like a horror action scene, or like when there's like this suspense of the, like when there's like something about to happen, but it's just really like ordinary place. And that sort of, I think that really shows the connection between this like, it's not just this like typical horror monster, it's an actual like, this is the British like society, and this is how like the refugees are experiencing the world. It's not, yeah, that's all.
If anybody doesn't have anything else to say, just double checking, we can move on to our fun question. Okay, so our fun question is, what fashion house do you think this monster models for? Our wonderful editor Aiden will be throwing up a picture right now. So I believe this monster models for Balenciaga. I just feel like the wrinkles are very. Actually, I might have to change my. Never mind. I think they model for Balmain because of the like. There was a collection I think in 2019 that they did like a little like wrinkled leather, and I just feel like it's very camp, and like the glowing eyes. It's very spooky season, fall, winter. So yeah.
That mud runway that they just did? I feel like it had a lot of their characters had the same kind of feeling. A lot of them look like monsters. And this guy was like coming out of the ground, and he's like, his movement reminded me a lot of some of the way the Balenciaga models were moving.
I would say Chanel because I feel like he's just sort of like timeless and like, you know, like he could be like in a movie from like the fifth. Okay, maybe not, but like, and his face is just sort of like so like modelly and Chanel-y in my opinion. So yeah.
To be honest, I don't know that much about fashion, so I'm just gonna say Gucci because Gucci's always out there doing something different. Yeah.
So bye.
And that's all, folks.